Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time it is when you're joining me for this discussion. My name is Spencer Williams, a physics educator, and today we'll be talking about the GIST learning strategy. The discussion will be largely generic, discussing the strategy as a whole, but will also include references to a sample lesson plan that can be found in the Prezi presentation you should have found this video in, or the description of the YouTube video if you somehow found the video without the presentation. If you need to take a second to obtain these materials for your own reference, please pause the video and do so now. Alright, thank you again for joining me. The GIST learning strategy was first developed by Cunningham in 1982. It is deceptively simple. Students are presented with a passage, asked to read it, and then asked to summarize its main point, or gist, in roughly 20 words. Now, you may be wondering why I, a physics educator, would be talking about this strategy. I know that when I first encountered it, I personally felt as though it was a strategy best suited for younger students in language content areas, and felt it held no relevance to what I would be teaching. After some time working with the strategy, however, I've come to a few important conclusions about its use outside such classrooms. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is that not all students will be performing at grade level linguistically. Students who are learning English and students with learning disabilities especially might be having linguistic difficulties in class that may need differentiated approaches to address. Of course, this doesn't make them any less intelligent or valid as students, but if you're watching this video, then hopefully you already knew that. Still, students performing below grade level linguistically might very well benefit from a strategy that seems to be geared toward younger students, so long as you, as a teacher, are careful not to become patronizing or shame the students in any way because of this. However, the use of this strategy moves beyond young age and students performing below grade level. A colleague of mine had a favorite saying regarding students. Best practices are best practices, she would say. In essence, what that means is that any adaptation, strategy, or other way of doing things in the classroom setting that assists students facing difficulties of any kind, ranging from troubles communicating to learning disabilities or emotional disabilities, is likely to positively affect the experiences of students who are not facing such difficulties, just as much, if not more. Best practices are best practices, no matter what. And acknowledging this is the first step, I think, to successfully applying the GIST strategy outside of its seemingly normal area of application. Take my area of expertise, physics. In the Prezi presentation that goes with this video, I cite an article by Grant and Lapp that discusses the difficulties students face in actualizing scientific literacy. If you're a science teacher, you likely already know about these difficulties. Science uses an entirely different vocabulary from what students are used to, and different techniques to gather and assess information. And when it doesn't, words that mean one thing to students in their everyday lives, such as law or mixture, might mean something only tangentially related in the sciences. Thus, even high school level classes, students can face linguistic difficulties when dealing with science texts, and these difficulties cause us to seek different approaches to confronting them. In the sample lesson plan I provided for our shared discussion, I utilized the GIST learning strategy to discuss Newton's laws of motion. After a brief framing activity to get students in the right mindset to discuss the topic, they're broken into discussion groups and asked to read 3 short passages, each discussing one of the 3 laws. The first, an object in motion stays in motion unless acted on by an outside force. The second, the force applied to an object is equal to the mass of the object times the acceleration it experiences. Force equals mass times acceleration. The third, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Although the exact wording of these laws may be foreign to students, and admittedly difficult to derive in a classroom setting, the concepts shouldn't be. They can be observed in everyday life, and these narratives provide an indirect way of doing that, while also asking them to test their ability to interpret both observations and what they're reading, as well as tasking them with working together in groups to come to a conclusion together. In this manner, the GIST strategy is being used to not only support the learning of physics, but linguistic skills, interpersonal skills, and problem-solving skills in the general sense. Although this lesson plan is only a hypothetical example, a theoretical lesson plan with no class attached to it, some assumptions and adaptations are built into it as an example, and these are some of the things that you might need to consider if you're going to utilize the strategy yourself in your own classroom. Students are grouped partially according to their linguistic ability and partially according to content area knowledge, with peer support given to students who may face extreme difficulties. Of particular concern, as discussed earlier, are students whose English linguistic skills are below the grade level and may have difficulty with the reading for whatever reason. Although it is possible in this case to keep the reading relatively simple, I myself wrote it, and you yourself could write reading for your classroom. If you plan to apply the strategy to other situations, you may find that you're asking your students to tackle a particularly difficult text, and you need to be ready to provide support as needed beyond the strategy to help them succeed. Of course, you should be ready to provide support to your students regardless of whether you're using this strategy or not. So, when is it appropriate to apply this learning strategy, and how can you adapt it to your own classroom? Like I said, I wouldn't blame you if you felt that it was suited for younger students in language arts content areas. But if you're a teacher outside of that category, I still recommend you give the strategy some consideration. Although asking your students to summarize the gist of, say, an entire chemistry textbook chapter or the entirety of War and Peace in only 20 words may not be the best idea, applying it to a smaller chunk of the material is an excellent way to break up the monotony of an otherwise drab and boring reading. You can apply the GIST strategy in the classroom setting, in a homework setting, or even simply as a guideline you give students at the beginning of the year and review frequently to help them along. The GIST learning strategy has some pretty tangible benefits when applied in these ways, even for older students, and I might say especially for older students. It sets itself up well as a formative assessment of sorts. By asking your students to summarize what they've read and condense it down to only the main points, you've essentially asked them if they understood the material they read. Even in the middle of a lesson, you can easily walk about the classroom and check on student learning. If they've gotten the gist, then you can move on and start going into the topic in more depth. If not, then you know you've got to double back and clear up some confusion. Beyond that, just because a student has made it to high school doesn't necessarily mean that they've learned how to read academically. I know when I personally came to college, one of the biggest changes that my peers and I had to face was realizing that we were on our own for reading and studying, and some of us made the transition better than others. The technique may seem a bit juvenile, but you can use it to help students learn how best to read and interpret readings on their own. A vital skill for those who intend to go on to higher education, and important even for those who don't, and not necessarily one that students learn or are familiar with, especially not in equal measures. I personally hope that this discussion has given you, if absolutely nothing else, something to think about when it comes to applying learning strategies outside their apparent area of application. If you liked the discussion, maybe share a comment and we can see if you got the gist of how the strategy works. Once again, my name is Spencer Williams, and I thank you for joining me for this discussion. Have a wonderful day, and please, never stop learning.